Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor, and if you didn't already know, today is World EV Day. And as you probably know, demand for EVs is rapidly growing all around the world, not least here in the UK. But whilst demand for new electric cars is certainly rising, is the same true in the used market? And what's the outlook like as we race towards 2030? Joining me to discuss more is Auto Trader's Commercial Director, Ian Plummer. Hello, Ian.
Hi there, James. Nice to see you.
Always good to have you on the show, Ian. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Now, this week we've seen the publication of August new car registration data, and amid the inevitable doom and gloom, sales of pure electrics, hybrids and plug-in hybrids all rose 32, 45 and 72% respectively. Now it's clear there's demand in the new market, in the new car market. Are you seeing that as well? And at the same time, is the same true in the used market as well?
You're quite right, James. There's definitely a growing, surging even level of interest in electric vehicles and into equally the wider sort of alternative fueled vehicle market, including the plug-in electrics and the other forms of hybrids, which are growing fast too. But I think it's firstly fantastic to see these strong numbers. I think we should sort of take with a bit of a pinch of salt the monthly numbers for August, because we know the month of August weighs so little in the grander scheme of things. But nonetheless, the year-to-date progress of electric and other forms of hybrid is also very strong. On Auto Trader, we're definitely seeing very similar trends. We're seeing, for example, that 1 in 7 of our new car advert views on Auto Trader are for a pure electric vehicle. And that's up from around 3.8% this time last year in 2020. But back then, if we were getting 1 in 7 now, back then, by my maths, that makes it about 1 in 25 users were looking at a new EV back then. So huge progress. AFVs account for, including those hybrids and so on, account for around 36% of our new car advert views, and that's tripling on prior year again. So a huge rise. But consideration rates are rising. I mean, they're very high, but they're rising fast too. That's fantastic. But we do see a complicated story regarding intent, though. So actually, a lot of users are looking at electric vehicles on these in new cars. Again, as I should add, we are talking new cars specifically here right now, but 3 in 4 of them have quite low intent. So in other words, they have in a basket of, let's say, 10 to 15 models typically, EVs won't be representing a large chunk of the cars they're looking at most. Having said that, those that are engaged and do have strong intent are really recognizing that in terms of their lead volumes, because lead volumes on EVs are growing fast and account for around 16% of total new car leads. That's on the sort of 8.4% year to date that battery electric weigh in those stats you just quoted. So clearly a lot of interest, but some translation of that interest, but a way to go really before we get to an ideal situation. On to used cars, there it's a situation of demand being sort of boosted by what's happening in new cars, but nothing like at the same level, and probably held back by supply. So in terms of users considering a used EV, that's around 6.3% right now, and it's rising. It's up from sort of 5.8% in May and around 5% in January at the start of this year. But used EVs only account for around 1.5% of used car advert views. And again, that sounds like a very low number. It is, but it's up, doubling actually from 0.8% in a year prior. So if you consider that one more time against the sort of relative reference point, I mentioned supply a minute ago, used EVs only weigh around 1%, 1.1%, I think precisely, of overall stock. Though understandably, therefore, used car advert views of those EVs aren't considerably higher than their weight of stock, but they are nonetheless quite a way ahead. So a contrasting in view, if you like, of interest in electric vehicles, but it does also become very relevant when you look at the speed of sale of these used electric vehicles, that there's this growing interest that you touched on in your introduction. So we can see average time to sell of any car in this rather strange market we're working in at the moment is only accelerating. But the average time it takes for an EV to sell, although still some way behind the current average for an ICE alternative, it's 36 days rather than 26 days for an ICE. That's gone jumping forward. EVs started from 58 days in April when we exited lockdown. And again, come down to 36 days now in August, whereas ICE started from 28 and come down to 26. So huge progress, I think, generally. growing interest, but still a rather complicated picture.
Let's just drill down to that demand just a little bit more, because as we know, in the used market as a whole, we've got this problem where the demand is bigger than supply. Is the same true with electric cars? I mean, are there enough electric cars to meet this growing demand, do you think?
Quite simply, no. But equally, again, for want of being overly complicated, it's not quite as simple as saying that it's purely a sort of a supply-led solution that we need. There are some models and some segments of the market where there's an excess of supply, and we're seeing the reverse in premium EVs, for example, of what we're seeing across the rest of the market with such strong price growth that I'm sure you've seen. The Auto Trader data showed that we were up to 17% like-for-like growth of pricing on a year-on-year basis. So with the caveat of the premium SUV type EVs, where there's probably been an excess of supply with many models coming into the market and not quite enough sort of demand to follow it, EVs do generally fit the same bill as what you described there. Not quite enough supply to match this growing level of interest in terms of consumer demand for EVs. But demand and supply are probably best looked at in two different ways as well. We've created demand by bringing in a great host of new products. So we've boosted the model choice of available EVs, probably double the relevant market, if you like, compared to about a year prior in terms of broader ranges of vehicles that people can choose from. So that's great. There's more choice of model. But there's also been a growth of availability. So we do have, apart from sort of more recent times when stock has been so scarce across many, many lines, we have seen a doubling of available supply of new and used vehicles on our platform. So both the model choice and the supply of available readily sort of orderable vehicles has led to a growth of interest. So it's sort of a supply-led solution that helps to build on the demand-led situation I described a second ago. But we are nonetheless seeing an issue, I think, of the lack of supply that's, again, general across the whole of the market. But we definitely will need to see a growth of further models coming to the market that respond to the choice point I just made a minute ago. 15% of users on our side who said they're not planning on buying an EV say so because they believe that they don't find today the right kind of available model on the market that suits their requirements in an EV variant. So we've made progress once more, but it feels like there's a long way to go if we should really break through.
Putting to one side the low intent, which you mentioned earlier on, are there any sort of standout models that you see consumers interested in, or is it across the board?
There are many, as I said, great new models coming to the market right now. We've seen a whole host of activity from brands who've brought some exciting new cars to the market. I think they've managed to change their brand positioning, the perception of their whole brand by bringing some great new cars into play. We've seen that with the likes of Volkswagen Group, with the huge push behind the likes of their ID range for Volkswagen, or for the e-trons of Audi and so on. Some iconic products like the Mustang and so on for Ford that are really boosting their positioning, or the Ioniq 5 for Hyundai, and a whole new sort of EV brand approach that's really boosted MG sort of burst into the market, I think you could say. A few standout models though within that list. The Hyundai Ioniq 5 has come from nowhere in the last few weeks to actually represent just short of 10% of ad views, and it's only accounting for about 1.7% of stock. So a hugely popular model that's, as I said, come from nowhere. And I think it is. I've had the chance to see that car in the flesh, and it's an exciting model. I mentioned the Mustang. That's the second in our list of most weighty models getting the most ad views, as is then the Q4 e-tron, the MG5, and the ID3. So there are a lot of winners out there, and it does feel that the more new car activity is going to be pushing around the edges of this choice message and the excitement of the new models that come to market, the more we're likely to build consumer interest out there. Not least because brands are also communicating a lot about these models. They're growing in interest levels, partly because they're great cars, partly because they're being talked about a lot. We're seeing now, if we analyze using the likes of Nielsen or Comscore data, we can see the weight of spend of brands is now proportionately greater on their alternative fuel vehicles than the rest of their ranges. In other words, we're spending more than half of all ad spend from manufacturers on those new vehicles, generating that excitement and interest that we touched on.
Let's just look at the outlook and in the years ahead towards 2030. I mean, do you think we're actually on track to meet the government's target? And if not, why?
Well, I think firstly, to come back to your point about whether we're on track, I think we should look at the numbers a little bit and look at the scale of the challenge. We are seeing growing demand. We're seeing growing supply as well, but not quite to the level we need across all the whole of the market and all the different segments and so on. But we considered, when we mapped out a forecast of how we might get to the road to 2030, I beg your pardon, what the steps would need to look like. But for example, in 2021, we'd need to be at around 11% of overall sales being pure electric. Now, currently, we're at 8.4% year to date, so I think we'll be shy of the 11% for 2021. That was our expectation, our forecast. To get from where we are today to where we think we needed to be next year, roughly 17%, we probably need to double the 8.4% we're currently at year to date, a heck of a chunky leap forwards. And then we need to double again in the following 2 years to get to 34% by 2024, and then roughly doubling every 2 years after that. So that's a heck of a consistently challenging number to continue growing by. So that is a tall order, to come back to your first point. Hybrids and the other variants of alternative fuel vehicles are doing particularly well. We'd probably see a forecast number that we did a year ago being exceeded by the end of this year when you add in all the other hybrids. So hybrids are proving to be a very useful stepping stone and helping on that journey towards the 2030 challenge. But fundamentally, to your second point, are we on track? Well, no, the data says not quite. What do we need to do to get there? We believe there are 3 I's that are required: further incentives, investment, and information to overcome the key barriers to entry for the majority of electric vehicle car buyers.
And do you think, I mean, if you get those 3 I's in place, do you think that low intent, which you were talking about, do you think that will be turned on its head?
Well, I'd like to think so. I've touched on those points briefly. The incentives point is probably the most crucial, I think, right now. It's a major barrier to entry, as you know. Cost, along with infrastructure, I'll come to in a second, are the 2 standouts that most consumers are consistently quoting back to us in all our research. And if you look at our marketplace, we can clearly see a mismatch between the cars that are available on the one side and what most people can afford to spend on a new car on the other side. To bring that to life and give you a few numbers, just 2% of the new electric vehicle stock on Auto Trader is under £25,000, whereas half of new ICE stock is in that price bracket. Ad views for cars with prices above or below £35,000, you know, the cutoff for the government grant, reveal a similar story. So roughly speaking, around a third of ad views taking place for electric vehicles on sub £35,000 cars, 2/3 obviously the other way around. That's roughly 50-50 for ICE vehicles, but above or below the £35,000 sort of threshold. So the vehicles aren't quite there for people to look at in these lower price brackets, but equally the people looking for these cars are generally wealthier and able to afford them too. But the average price of an electric vehicle really shows you the kind of gap we've still got. So we see a very consistent picture here that's frankly not actually improving either. The average price of a new volume brand, I beg your pardon, a new volume electric hatchback is roughly 75% higher than its ICE equivalent. I mean, that's a colossal gap that most people couldn't perceive as being feasible for them if they're in that sort of price bracket of car. And the cost, the chunky cost of the electric powertrain is really what makes it very difficult to absorb that difference for these volume players in the smaller car categories and so on. That gap of 75% shrinks to around 25% for the average volume SUV and only 19% for a premium brand SUV. I say only, those are very significant differences. And so we do really need to do more to bridge those price gaps. And that's where incentives come to play. Give you a few ideas of the numbers again to bring this to life. The average used 0 to 3-year-old alternative fuel vehicle is around £32,000. The ICE equivalent is £23,000. And even further, the pure EV is around £35,500. So that's 48% more expensive than its ICE equivalent. Those are very chunky gaps. that the typical used car buyer isn't currently going to be able to sort of contemplate. As you get towards needing sort of £2,000, £4,000, £5,000 EVs, as hopefully the park grows and gets older, we'll be able to expand choice in more people. But today, when we look at our demographics data on Autotrader, who's looking at EVs, it really is, as I touched on briefly, the most affluent postcodes across the country. That could be sort of the west of London, it could be the southern areas of Manchester, Oxford, and so on. There's also high-income households. It's slightly older buyers and those who are looking probably for a second car, who have off-street parking and so on. We're a long, long way from really being able to democratize EVs. And we've seen in countries like France and Germany grants of around 3 times what we have in the UK that are really starting to make a difference. And we're being a little left behind. Norway's a bad example, potentially it's too far from us, but they're at around 80% now of penetration of EVs. We've got a long way to go. Brands can't themselves break the back a price parity issue. We really need to be at price parity, I think, by around the middle of this decade, if we're to hit the challenge of 2030 and so on. But to get there, they need scale. To get scale, they need to sell more cars now. To sell more cars now, I think we need the incentives to actually be the levels of the like we're seeing in Germany, France, and elsewhere, to help really encourage the revolution to gain pace and to generate the economies of scale, which will help brands reduce the pricing further down the road, and then allow the reduction of the grant. But unfortunately, it doesn't feel that that's quite where the government has its headset.
Yeah. I wouldn't go so far as saying there's a class divide, but there's definitely a gap, isn't there, between, like you say, the affluent buyers and the man on the street. I can't really come up with a better term, but there's definitely a gap, isn't there? And that does need to close up, like you said. Now, my final question is just about hybrids. Now, this week at the Munich Motor Show, the Renault Group's tech boss said that the EU's proposal to ban hybrids by 2030 is misguided, and 2040 is a more realistic target, given infrastructure cost and labour skills concerns, etc. Would you welcome the UK followed that, or are we just in danger of just kicking the can further down the road and never actually tackling this problem?
Well, I think I personally welcome the challenge of 2030. I think from an environmental point of view, it's a challenge that nearly all of us embrace. I think we've seen huge changes in the general public's perception of the environmental challenge over the last couple of years for reasons we won't need to elaborate on right now. I think, though, unfortunately, we need to make the challenge match up with the support we put to achieve the challenge. And there's probably a little bit more sort of target setting and announcement than there is substance to actually drive the change. So I would prefer, to be honest, an ambitious 2030 challenge, but with the right level of support in terms of those 3 I's. The incentives I mentioned, the infrastructure we need rapidly to increase the kind of charging solutions we've got out there, which will overcome this hybrid issue. The reason why people often think that hybrid is a solution for them is because many people, 40%, for example, don't have off-street parking, and they believe that it's a safer solution to manage their infrequent, but nonetheless relatively regular longer journeys and so on. But the SMMT, for example, has called for around 2.3 million charging solutions to be put in place to achieve the target that we have. We're roughly at around 25,000. The CMA called for 10 times the amount of, not quite, but the SMMT's lofty ambitions. But there's clearly a gap there. And if we don't bridge those gaps between where we'd like to get to, where we're setting our targets, and the reality of such a huge industry change, but also a personal change. We're talking about changing habits that have been ingrained for decades, and the buying habits, the driving habits, I think do need significant support if we're really to achieve a sustainable 2030 challenge.
I think it's something we're going to be talking a lot about over the next few years, aren't we? But Ian, as always, absolute pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for today's Car Dealer Live. Join us again very soon. Bye-bye.